Thank you very much to all participants for being here today, or everybody listening to the recording. I don't know about you, but I'm struggling to adjust to these online conferencing alternatives, mainly because when you go to a conference, there's quite a few things you get, like a good night's sleep away from your young family, in my case, and maybe a bacon bap in the morning. There was none of those for me. I'm sure you're missing other things. Hopefully, at least in terms of content and discussion, we will live up to your before COVID expectations. A couple of minor housekeeping points. I will try to deliver a short or not too short talk in about 40 minutes and then address all questions at the end. So if you have any questions that pop to mind while I'm speaking, please put them on the Q&A function. And if you see other people's questions that you think are interesting, vote for them. Usually thumbs up should be there, so you can vote for good questions. And in the end, we will try to address them by popularity. So please vote on others as well as putting in your own questions. Now, when we first thought about today, and this was before the COVID-19 crisis, we thought we would talk about long-term possibilities for changes in UK procurement, in particular in higher education. Then the crisis hit. And of course, there were pressures to talk about COVID-19, but I wouldn't like to make it all about this. I think it could be quite boring to just be talking about COVID, at least from an academic perspective, where I don't think there's much to say. So what I'm trying to do is a bit of a mix of both. And the idea is to try to cover three main areas. So first, what's been the regulatory reaction to the COVID-19 crisis, and what it means that we are now in a scenario where procurement rules are at least partially deactivated, and how we're going to transition back into reactivating them. I also want to talk about the medium-term challenges, particularly around Brexit, which seems to have taken now a second seat. But of course, it's an issue that is very important, and it worries me more and more that the UK sector can be looking at a cliff edge at the end of this year, as well as what it means to have a post-Brexit regulation of procurement, mainly trying to achieve social goals, and in particular, I'm guessing a very strong focus on trying to restart the economy. And finally, looking at the issue of digital tech, which is going to take some time, but seeing how technology could be used in this changing context, and maybe to support longer term changes. Now, to the first bit of it, and the COVID-19 crisis, of course, procurement has never been so present, I think, in the media and in the newspapers, even in the context of other procurement situations that attracted interest, like Ferrygate recently, or other issues. But if we look at it from the regulatory perspective, mainly for the core of the emergency, procurement rules just got deactivated. And we all knew about the extreme urgency procedure, one that we are never supposed to really use. It's extremely exceptional. But pretty early on, there was UK guidance, and shortly followed by European guidance, that is pretty clear to say, for everything that has to deal with immediately responding to the needs of the hospitals, of the public health organizations, but also beyond that, of social care, care homes, or even universities, the procurement rules just get out of the way. And it's possible to directly award contracts without prior notice. Basically, direct negotiations and any commercial approaches are allowed. The UK guidance was somehow measured. I had some lawyers email me saying that they thought it was quite bullish in just allowing direct awards. But I think they were probably surprised a couple of weeks after, when the Commission came in and actually said there's no requirement whatsoever at European level in terms of what you have to do when you are under this exemption. And actually, they supported very proactive commercial approaches, such as even sending delegates to other countries to try to source what was required. So I think it's fair to say that from the regulatory perspective, the guidance has been issued. It's pretty clear to say procurement rules should definitely not be an obstacle now. Of course, there are some safeguards built into the system, and the procurement authority has to at least document why they are resorting to this procedure. And I think it's best practice to keep good track records of all of the decisions made. And I'm sure this is being done. But beyond that, beyond justifying what is the immediately pressing need or the difficulty that it would prevent complying with urgent procedures or standard procedures. I think there's nothing else that needs to be done from a regulatory perspective. Now, the extent to which this applies, or what's the remit of this exemption is something that maybe can create some doubts. It's very clearly for PPE, ventilators, and whatever direct consumables that the NHS may need. But is it also available for other things? So, for example, could it be available for IT? So, and I think this is something that may pop up or may have already popped up in your practice. And I would say, yes, it's available beyond PPE ventilators. There's no reason to limit it to only healthcare directed emergency supplies for two reasons. And I think here the UK government's guidance was very clear. It's that it's equally unforeseeable that there's going to be a pandemic as to what is the effect of the pandemic on supply chains. And I think any procurer that sees an abrupt disruption in the supply chain of something they really need to procure and that doesn't see a clear way forward in terms of standard advertised opportunities should be free to go and engage in extremely urgent procurement, even if it's for things that would not immediately seem necessary to react to the pandemic. For example, I would say anything that is necessary to repurpose laboratories in universities for those involved in supporting the development of tests or vaccines, or anything that has to do even with allowing academics to be made available to the government. So if somebody's computer breaks and there's no way of getting standard deliveries, then of course urgent procurement should be allowed. That is not to say this is a free for all, but I think this is not the time to be splitting hairs. And I wouldn't think that when there is a real reason why something is urgent, there's going to be issues with litigation down the line. There's also other aspects of the guidance, particularly in the UK, that are maybe a bit more complicated to process and that can create practical problems, because as far as I've seen, the other PPNs, the number 2 and number 3 of 2020, basically they are not real procurement guidance. They are more about trying to keep feeding the supply chain, even when, for example, we have temporary workers or agency workers that are unable to work. And my question there is not so much on the procurement aspects of it, which is mainly largely to keep executing contracts as if they were taking place, but it's more about where's the budget going to come when the work that is not being done now needs to be done later on. But I'm guessing these are issues more for finance departments than procurement departments, but I thought I would flag it here. Now, beyond the regulatory response, when we're looking at the practice of the procurement, and this is what the media is full with, I think that there's loads of oversimplification, but of course, there are loads of things that could go wrong in trying to scale up the procurement of PPE or ventilators in the way that the government has tried. But I also think there's a fair amount of mishandling of the emergency. There's lots of questions around why did the UK decide not to participate in European joint procurement until pretty late in the game. And in particular, there's lots of discussions on the ventilator challenge. And I think, quite frankly, that from a legal perspective, there's been quite a few breaches. Also, I didn't have time to include it in the slides, but there's quite a few issues with the development of apps and other sort of solutions for NHSX, particularly through modification of contracts. And I think here, what I'm starting to see is that there's been loads of actions taken by procurement teams on the basis of different understandings of what the rules allow or not allowed to. And this is something we'll have to come back to after the crisis and look at it. I really hope that there's going to be post-crisis public inquiry into procurement, because I think there's plenty untold success stories of good procurement, but I also think there's quite a few worrying abuses of the procurement rules that we'll have to look at in more detail. After the crisis, I think that there's going to be a massive opportunity for learning, and this is something that I think we'll have to turn our minds to. In particular, because at some point, the emergency is going to quiet down. And at some point, it will be necessary to engage with procurement as normal or new normal, whatever that's going to mean. And this is going to be different for every organization. There's going to be organizations that have just been prevented from carrying out procurement just because it's not possible to do it from working from home or for whatever other reasons, but that had not to deal with any urgent procurement. There's organizations that have completely switched to emergency procurement, doing very little of the ordinary procurement. There's lots of organizations doing two-track procurement. So every organization will be different. But I think there has to be a decision at some point to say, well, things are not extremely urgent anymore, so we have to go back to normal. And here I think the approach, to me, should be the opposite from what's happening with the lockdown. So with the lockdown, the idea is you cannot go back to normal too early because that's going to create more problems than the ones it's going to sort out. I think in procurement, it's a little bit the opposite. I think there's no real risk or damage in trying to go back to procurement as normal as soon as possible. Because what's going to happen is that if an authority launches a procurement that is advertised and that maybe it's urgent, but it's not extremely urgent, so it's with shortened deadlines, and nothing good comes out of it, then it can immediately resort to extreme urgency procurement if it needs to. So I think here the approach should be try to go back to compliance with advertising and competition as soon as possible, because you always have the fallback position of resorting to direct awards if there's been no offers that are acceptable during that period. So I would err on the side of more transparency rather than the opposite. And the other thing that will be very interesting, definitely for academics, but I think for practitioners as well, is to try to learn from what has this period of unregulated or no rules procurement taught us. So what has been done properly, what could have been done differently, and in particular, how much of it can we retain when we go back to compliance with the rules? Because in the loads of discussions, and we'll come back to that in a moment around Brexit, there is this always annoying to me mantra that the procurement rules are too stringent, that they prevent good procurement. I just don't think that's true. I just don't think we are in a culture of maximizing the flexibility that the procurement rules created, particularly after the 2014 reform. And so what I would like is to come up with some body of good practices or different approaches that we can learn from this period that in particular can guide us through more innovative approaches of market engagement and consultation that I think can alleviate loads of the problems that we see in practice. But maybe this is just me wanting to see a silver lining into all of these complicated times. Now, moving on from COVID, because hopefully this is not going to last forever, although it can be a long period of transition, there are some opportunities or some perceived opportunities down the line, and I think that's something we can discuss a bit together. The elephant in the room to me is it, and there was loads of discussion earlier this year about a bonfire of procurement regulations and trying to completely do away with the PCR 2015 and come up with a new system post-Brexit. In particular, as it emerges that the Johnson's government approach is not to have a very comprehensive free trade agreement, but something more limited. And so the idea would be to try to scale back the procurement regs to whatever is required under the WTO Common Procurement Agreement. There were some press reports on the Cabinet Office working on it. There was a consultation with some academics, and there is a working group, as far as I know, still active, although I'm not linked to it in any way. And we have also had some leading academics like Professor Arrowsmith from Nottingham publishing in particular a working paper with proposals, and those are her input into this working group. So there is some noise about deregulation of procurement and also on reduction of access to remedies. And this issue of deregulation is one that is maybe a misnomer. I think for whatever reason, the evolution of procurement in the UK has been such that it moved from a more guidance-based, practice-based procurement regulation into a more legislated procurement regulation. And the proposals now seem to be to have a de-escalation of what's in the legislation. So have a very bare bones procurement law, and then loads of guidance that can be interpreted in different ways. The issue here is that, to my mind, this is just a change of the place where the regulation is held. And that doesn't mean that it's going to make the life of the procurers any easier, because it's equally complicated to interpret guidance as it is to interpret legislation. Now, of course, the issue is that it's going to have potentially a massive impact on remedies because it's more difficult to enforce guidance than it is to enforce legislation. But in any event, the UK is a jurisdiction with very limited procurement litigation, at least getting to the point of the courts. So I don't really see this as a big advantage, but it's something maybe we can discuss later. The other main driver in this post-Brexit reimagination of the procurement rules is linked to social value. And there was a consultation by the government last summer. It's been stopped or abandoned as a result of parliamentary elections and I guess change of priorities, but this is an issue that is bound to resurface. And of course, there's going to be a need to try to think about how post-Brexit, post-COBIT procurement can be used to try to support local economies. And again, this is going to require some very, very difficult choices. I think that one of the big difficulties that we're going to have is that trying to add more and more layers of secondary goals to what is going to be already a pretty complicated transition is going to make things quite complicated. So I'm not a big fan, but this is where I see things going, and probably that's something that is already on your radar as well. Now, to me, the big question in all this is why do we need procurement reform at all in the UK? And I'm not sure that there's a very clear reason for it, other than we don't like the EU's rules. But I'm not sure that that's even the majority view in the procurement profession. Could be that procurement profession doesn't like any procurement rules, could be, but I doubt that's the case. Now, what I think is being greatly underestimated is the extent to which changing the rules again is going to create massive disruption and create loads of learning costs, transition costs, and adaptation costs for the procurement front line. And I'm not sure that at a time when the procurement function is so stretched, we want to add that on the workload. The PCRs were changed in 2015, so we've had about 5 years of experience with them now, and you can still see in practice that things are still done as they used to be done in the 2006 PCRs in some areas. Maybe not in centralized or collaborative procurement, because this is one of the areas that has changed more, but in day-to-day local procurement, I think there's lots of activities still led by loads of inertia. So trying to change things now, I think it's not a great timing decision. The other issue is, of course, that it's unclear to me what more flexibility is needed in the framework. And it could be that we are all very risk averse because we manage public or quasi-public money, because we of course care about the reputation of our organizations. But I think there's loads of flexibility in the system, in the way that contracting authorities can engage with the market before launching procurements, in the way that they can decide to go for procurements involving negotiations, in the way that they can deal with different award criteria, introducing life cycle costing, and loads of opportunities that have not really been exploited. So I think we'd better be off, but just not changing the regulatory framework and simply trying to keep promoting best practice and cross-learning than rather than reinventing the wheel. But also I find the issue of trying to curtail access to remedies very problematic. And this is not a problem of whether lost profits should be paid in damages claims or not. I think that's a bit of a red herring. It happens very, very rarely. To me, the big issue is that we need to rethink the remedy system in procurement in the UK in general, because it's really much more restrictive than in other jurisdictions. And if the UK is going to go its own way after Brexit, have its own rules, we want to track any sort of international competition for procurement contracts, we will have to rethink the remedy system. So to me, I would say let's keep the PCR 2015 as it is for as long as possible, and let's just focus on lower level best practice and other improvements. But I know this is probably not the majority view, so I'll be happy to take questions and comments on this a little bit later. Also, I think the whole issue about procurement reform is mainly being driven too much by the lawyers, right? And probably loads of procurement practitioners without a legal background would probably be not nodding their heads in agreement. And I think the problem is that the only thing lawyers know how to do is to change the rules. If we don't like a rule, we just try to change it. If we don't like somebody else's rule, we try to improve on it because we think we are maybe smarter than them. But I think there's now an opportunity to try to rely on digital tech to achieve things that are possible within the legal framework that don't need a change of rules. And actually changing the rules could be a bad idea. I think that now, for the reasons I'll give you in a few minutes, there's real opportunity to start working on enabling big data analytics, and once the data and the analytics are in place, to try to deploy some machine learning to try to support procurement decision making. I'm not talking about automating procurement or doing away with procurement discretion. I'm just saying there's lots of space for supporting the procurement function in ways that can maximize actually that flexibility by making information and options more available to the procurer. And to do that, if we want to be serious about it in the UK, again, keeping a stable regulatory framework would be very, very important. First, because trying to implement new technologies with new rules is just making it too difficult. And any coder will tell you that it's difficult enough to translate law into code or into rules as to have changes in the law as you go along. The other issue is, of course, however big the UK innovation market is, it would be easier to just stay aligned to the EU rules, because then the solutions can be developed for a European-wide market. There's way more incentive for companies to do it. And it could also be that the UK innovation can be exported to other EU countries if they have exactly the same rules and if they have exactly the same requirements. So I think maybe one of the facilitating aspects of trying to push for digital tech transformation in the UK is actually to keep the rules as they are, even if this is a bit of a counterintuitive argument. Now, in trying to use digital tech, I don't think we should be just using tech for the sake of it. I think it needs to be a use of tech for a purpose. And probably one of the main combinations that we could think about is trying to push for sustainable digital procurement. This is where I think the medium to long-term strategic goals should lie. And it's about combining the two big strategic goals of digital transformation and more sustainability, so that we can use sustainable digital technologies to promote more sustainable procurement. And of course, this is pretty complicated. There's lots of uncertainty about how the technology is going to evolve. It's pretty complicated to know what are the long-term impacts of changing the way of doing things. And I don't have a crystal ball. So what I'm going to do just is use the next few minutes to speculate a little bit around this area. But of course, it's all speculation, and it's all subject to the better view of any of you from the ground, or anybody else with a better ability to foresee the future. Now, to me, in the research I'm carrying out, there's loads of talk about different technologies, and the OECD has mapped all of the digital technologies that could potentially be useful. Of course, there are some that are quite mechanistic, such as the use of 3D printers, and for example, they are developing an important role in the PPE challenge in some hospitals at the moment. But I don't think 3D printing is a massive change in the procurement function itself. It's more an issue of execution of contracts. So I'm not going to concentrate on that. I'm concentrating on three main technologies that are seen as potentially transforming procurement. And using transformation is something that makes me quite uncomfortable. I would prefer to say to support procurement going forward. And the three technologies are the usual suspects: artificial intelligence, blockchain, and the Internet of Things. Very simply, when I talk about artificial intelligence, and I am not a technologist, I think about technologies that can process data, big data, massive amounts of data that we cannot even imagine, in a way that humans cannot do. And that can use that processing of data to allow for some machine learning solutions, basically for algorithms to classify or predict outcomes on the basis of the data that they are being fed, on the basis of the training that we give them. And of course, this could create some automation of some processes, such as, for example, information classification. On the other hand, when I talk about blockchain, and that's probably something most of you have heard about, this is mainly a system of decentralized information management that has the main advantage of creating a tamper-evident, I don't think it's really tamper-resistant, data management protocol. So that basically, if anybody tries to change past information, this is obvious to everybody. And also, it's increasingly difficult to do as the system keeps growing in the chain. And finally, the Internet of Things is basically the use of sensors or technology devices to generate data automatically and to feed the data into the machine learning or blockchain solution. So basically, it's a way of trying to bridge this virtual world, real world frontier, or to create oracles that can help us have a swift connection of these two systems. So this is the way in which I refer to each of these three technologies. And it might be a simplification, but it helps me navigate the challenges. It's difficult to foresee when these technologies will be available, and I have no better view than anybody else. But I keep going back to what the technological consultancy companies say. And in 2018, their expectation would be that by 2020 to 2023, it will be possible to deploy loads of robotic process automation and machine learning, of course, provided the data is available, and I'll come back to that. Whereas other applications such as blockchain or Internet of Things or data classification that are a bit more advanced would take a bit longer to develop, more into 2023, 2028. Whether this is still a good timeline or not, it's something I cannot really assess. The evidence is a bit sketchy, but I would think that the whole thing has switched a bit more, and probably we don't have lots of machine learning implemented yet in 2020. And with the current crisis, I don't know if this is something that is going to accelerate, because there's loads of people at home with nothing else to do than experiment with machine learning, or the opposite. So I don't know whether we'll see an acceleration, but probably we will still have to wait a little bit. So all I'll have to say is pretty much a bit further into the future. But the issue of data should not be overlooked. And I'm sure you will have seen it in many contexts. Just as a small anecdote, but for example, the University of Bristol, it's been a challenge to put together the data simply on, for example, travel, and to try to understand what it means in terms of the climate impact of the university. And that's in part a procurement challenge because of the way that the data is created and collected and stored and distributed and shared. And I'm sure loads of you share the same problems or the same challenges. And this is something that at the highest level of regulatory policy making, the European Commission has already put on the agenda. There are loads of initiatives now to correct the dearth or the low quality of data going forward, such as things that you probably know, like the Open Contracting Data Standard that is being promoted by the Open Contracting Partnership, the new rules on e-forms that will kick in next year, new electronic government APIs, the also entry into force of the revised public sector information directive, which is now the Open Data Directive, recommendations on business to government data sharing, and so on and so forth. I think that right now, any procurement organization that wants to think about how to take advantage on digital technologies in the future, what they should do is really get their data architecture sorted. And not only for the future. I think, of course, that's an important first step, and it's about creating something that's going to help us work in the future with the data. But I also think there's a big need for a very ungrateful task, which is to create a backward-looking database of everything that has been procured in the last few years. There's still in the books of the organization, particularly anything that has to do with equipment or stocks of consumables that may require further treatment down the line, particularly thinking about issues around recycling or repurposing. And I think that that's an important strategic area where loads of benefits could be achieved if this was done seriously. So I would say, as soon as there's capacity, working on the data architecture should be the top priority. Why? Because then we will be able, once data is there, to start using AI and start using machine learning and other things to support ourselves. For example, things that I can imagine, but I'm sure people will have better ideas. Otherwise, I will already be a millionaire by having developed some apps. But what I can see is, for example, looking at sustainability, there is plenty of scope for big data analytics on the basis of sustainability. For example, trying to use things such as travel data to really tell us where are the main impacts that a specific organization is having, so that we can concentrate on developing sustainability screens or indexes around those areas. So it could be that the data tells stories that we didn't actually learn because they are counterintuitive. It could be that, for example, the biggest environmental impact of an organization is not about work funded transport, but it's about what the employees do to commute to work, for example. And this is something that is very difficult to capture with the existing measures as far as I can see them, but it's something that big data could help us do. And then we could create different projects around that, such as, I don't know, car sharing projects or other sorts of incentives that could be quite useful. We could then also use machine learning to analyze against sustainability goals that we have set ourselves. So for example, we could ask algorithms to forecast the impact of different procurement options in terms of sustainability impacts for the organization in ways that are more advanced or more comprehensive than we could manually do. And that should help us both in procurement specific decisions, but also in the planning of our sustainability procurement decisions in terms of trying to migrate from higher impact to lower impact in a way that doesn't really distort the functioning of the organization. Of course, in terms of regulatory compliance, there are pretty significant gains that could be achieved with artificial intelligence. There are experiences, and for example, the case of the electronic procurement in Ukraine is quite interesting in terms of compliance automation. So if you have a fully electronic procurement system that creates very clear business processes that need different authorizations, you have a pretty fail-safe system to try to prevent deviation from compliance. And this is an academic speaking, but making academics comply with the rules is like herding cats. So probably for higher education organizations, compliance automation is one area where there can be big gains in the short term. It's also possible, but this is going to take some more time and some complication to develop recommender or expert systems to try to guide procurement decisions in a way that is not only compliant, but includes other aspects from a business perspective or supply chain management perspective. And it could even be possible to put it into chatbots, not necessarily a queued robot like the one I showed earlier that talks to you, but a more sort of click through and getting tailored responses from a system in a way that could maybe alleviate some of the work of procurement teams in answering queries from potential internal clients. I'm not so sure that we could use AI to design our sustainability policies going forward. I don't think they're going to get that smart, but this is something that we can maybe also discuss. Finally, a couple of words on blockchain. To be honest, I don't think blockchain is going to have any significant application in procurement, mainly because blockchain is very powerful as a tool when there are issues of intermediation where the intermediaries can be bypassed, such as Bitcoin. It's the obvious one, to do away with financial organizations altogether, and also with controls on how money flows and the taxation of it. Bitcoin is brilliant, and the blockchain technology that enables it, of course, is brilliant. But when we talk about public sector procurement, I really think that the public sector is extremely averse to the idea of completely decentralizing the blockchain and not having control over it. So I think the blockchain that we are seeing implemented in some pilots in public procurement is always a permissioned blockchain, which means it's centralized and it requires an off-blockchain mechanism of authorization that basically kills the main functional advantages of the blockchain. This is something I could expand if somebody's interested in the Q&A, maybe in a separate email conversation. But everything I've seen written about using blockchain for procurement has a big problem of complexity. There's a paper that some computer scientists in London wrote a couple of years back. They said, oh, you could use blockchain to run the tender on blockchain. And they have an interesting caveat saying, well, of course, procurement documentation is very complex and blockchain can only support something in the small hundreds of words for every document. So we just assume that you could simplify your technical specs and your contract to just be a few hundred words, which of course doesn't make a lot of sense. I think the same issue applies to smart public contracts. There will be very limited application for them, except for the delivery of digital assets. And I'm not sure how much of that we're buying. And I think that in terms of working as a procurement information exchange platform, there are also quite a few limitations because existing databases probably do the work without the need to think about how we're going to mine and process all of this information. So all in all, from all the technologies that I have seen so far, I think what's really potentially promising is big data analytics and machine learning deployed on top of it. And that's why data is so important. Now, in all this, the sustainability aspect of the technologies themselves usually gets lost. It's an afterthought. You may have seen the UK and in partnership with the World Economic Forum guidelines on the procurement of digital technologies that came out last year. And they are just purely technology centric. They're about what technologies are being used, how to have capability to understand the technologies, a little bit of the ethics of all that, but there's nothing about the sustainability of the solutions themselves. And I think that can be a problem because, for example, putting anything on a blockchain, particularly if you are relying on proof of work blockchains, has an astronomical climate change impact that, of course, no institution committed to sustainability would want to create. So I think the sustainability of the digital tech itself and how it's procured is something that needs to be front loaded, and that analysis needs to come first. And looking at what's the life cycle of the solutions that we have in place and the ones that we would like to replace them with, and see how to minimize the impact altogether. I also think it could be wrong to just go after the new shiny thing simply because technology can do it when it's going to have a negative impact on sustainability. For example, I think that if we have a system in place that works and it only needs to be replaced in 10 years, then we need to keep with it until it's exhausted, unless there are very clear major gains to be had from replacing it at this point in time. And I think this is something that's probably going to be quite important now, that I think, and this only came to me this morning, but of course, one of the big issues that are going to come up in higher education procurement soon is IT procurement. Because right now I'm just using my laptop that I had bought privately with my private internet connection and some absurdly inadequate headphones and other things. But if we are to deliver online teaching of quality, there's going to have to be a very significant thinking about IT equipment for academics and support staff working from home, or working from their offices, or migrating from one to the other, depending on the circumstances. And that's going to be very important. And it will be very important to have sustainability at the forefront of these considerations. So there's another challenge emerging. And why is it in general so important for the universities to and the organizations you work for to support universities in this? Well, basically, first, because we need to put our money where our mouths are. And in Bristol, we were first in the UK, maybe in the world, I don't know, to declare a climate emergency. But that means we really need to be consequential with it. And we need to have our procurement, like everything else, sustainability driven. But the other one is because universities are organizations that are notoriously difficult to change. But now COBIT has basically shown that more or less, and in different ways of quality, we can do loads of things in different ways that were unthinkable 6 months ago. Like this seminar itself. If you told me 6 months ago, it would be possible to have a seminar with 200 plus people attending, where everybody's sitting in their own rooms, that would have blown my mind. So I think this is an opportunity to just take a very hard line saying, we have to be really committed to pushing the feasibility boundary. And as the universities, we need to really change the way we operate for loads of reasons. Of course, we need to keep the pedagogy and the quality of our degrees, but what we need to do more than anything else is really try to change things, taking advantage of the change that's been made possible. So basically, this is what I wanted to say. I'm very keen to move on to the Q&A. Thank you all for your attention, and I'll take your questions as popular or as they come. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Albert, for a great presentation. We've received a number of questions and comments from our delegates, so it'd be great if we could go through them now. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Suzanne Picken, Head of Membership and Marketing at LUPC, and I'm going to be facilitating the Q&A session. So let's have a look at some of the more popular questions. Just bear with me a second. I think, yes, the most popular question has been around, there's been reports from contracting authorities of unexpected or unjustified price hikes from suppliers in the wake of the real or perceived relaxation of the procurement rules. Have you found that there's been reports of that, Albert?
Well, I have read about loads of price gouging reports in PPE and in other emergency products, but not more generally in other contracts. I think here what the contracting authority needs to try and do is look at what are the modification clauses in the contracts, in particular there are price revision clauses, and I think they need to be mindful of the limits on those modifications. So under the applicable rules, any material change that would change the financial balance in favor of the supplier is not allowed. So it could be that in some cases, the difficult situation is that there's a need to just reject the price change requests. And if the supplier isn't able to deliver, then move on and try to replace the contract. I know that makes lives difficult, but I think contracting authorities would be doing themselves a disfavor if they were just accepting price revisions that down the line could be queried or challenged.
Thanks, Albert. That's good advice. A question here from Rob Logan. A lot of HE procurement colleagues are nervous about the intended scope of PPN 220 on supply relief. The language of PPN is very broad, and clearly the government wants the wheels of the economy working, but it doesn't change procurement or charities law, so its impact on universities is limited. How comfortable can we be relying on our discretion not to take action to support suppliers who may believe they are at risk?
Well, yeah, as you would expect from Rob, that's a tricky question. And I think what I would think about is what is the impact it's going to have in the medium and long term for the universities. So even if the university has a duty to manage its resources very carefully, I think it can rely on government guidance if there would be a material negative impact for the university in the medium or long term if they were not to keep the supply chains in place. So I think one of the worst things that could happen to universities is to come out of lockdown with all of the new plans on how to do things differently, just to find out they don't have access to the supply chains that they were counting on. So I guess here the difficult issue on how to exercise discretion is, of course, we cannot burn money that we manage in trust, but at the same time we cannot shoot ourselves in the foot because if we're going to end up paying more through emergency procurement or new procurement mechanisms once the existing suppliers fall through, then that's, all things considered, not in the best interest of the institutions and the interest that we are defending in trust. I know this is probably not a very functional answer, but this is what I would have to say about it.
It's quite a hard balancing act to get it right. So moving on to the next question. Time is the precious commodity that none of us or our stakeholders have enough of. What tips would you advocate to help mitigate this risk during the post-COVID-19 catch-up or the Brexit transition period?
I think it's about concentrating immediately on what's urgent. And then on what's going to be making very big differences. And if it's something that it's not urgent or is not going to make a very big difference in the medium or long run, then that probably should be deprioritized, even if usually we would spend time on that. By this, what I mean is probably there's not a lot of benefit in trying to tweak around issues that will have a minor operational or financial impact in the university. I think in terms of, for example, logistics management, it would be trying to implement an ABC mechanism so that you concentrate lots of time in your A, which is what's really urgent, keeps you working operationally. B would be what's going to have a major impact and improve things, maybe even generating more time in the medium term. And then C would be things that don't meet any of those requirements. Again, I know it's very easy for me to say sitting here, and it's going to be difficult to prioritize, but I think a hard look at what tasks lay ahead to try to get rid of those that have minimal operational financial impact is maybe a way of freeing up some time.
Thank you. A question from Don Bowman, LUPC here. The UK government is allowed to support the UK defence sector manufacturing as this is exempt under PCR, which is understandable as you cannot risk reliance on other countries. Do you think this should and could be extended to the supply of medical equipment and PPN to ensure a domestic supply chain in times of medical crisis can be scaled up?
Um, I know it's not going to be a popular answer, but I don't think so. I don't think this is time for protectionism, in particular going into Brexit, because we don't know how long this situation is going to last for. We don't know if whatever UK capacity is developed would be sufficient for the UK going forward. For now, we are extremely reliant on imports, and will probably remain reliant on imports for a long time. I also think there's a major need for more international cooperation, and for countries that get off the peak, start sharing what they have with others, and so that there can be some reciprocity in the future. I think this is not a time for protectionism. So by all means, the UK government should be doing what it can to boost capability in the UK for the production of PPE and other products that are necessary. But I don't think it should be in a way that ring fences that production only for UK use, or preventing exports, or having export bans, because that will only create retaliation, and it could make the decision much worse in the long term.
Okay, moving on to a couple of questions that we've got about RPA, so robotic process automation. A couple of questions are, do you have thoughts on how greater use of RPA could support procurement in a positive way? And also, could you provide an example of what may become robotic as part of the robotic process?
So for example, I think invoice management is something that could be subjected to RPA, and I think some organizations probably already have it. So it's maybe not a big innovation, but I think it's a good example. So usually what would happen is you will have the contract, it will have rules on how to invoice. Supplier will send the invoice, somebody manually checks the invoice and approves it, and then it goes into the payment process. If the rules in the contract on how to invoice are pretty clear, so the periodicity is clear, what can be covered is clear, the unit prices are clear, this is something that probably doesn't require manual checks, because you know sort of what you expect every month, and you could have the system just automated within parameters, saying if the invoice comes with, of course, the information in a way that can be read by the machine. So probably it's not good to just have a PDF submitted, but you need to have some sort of spreadsheet or other sort of file. Then the system could automatically just apply checks saying, does this come from a valid contract? Yes. Is it the right period to invoice? Yes. Is it for the items that we expected? Yes. And the price we expected? Yes. Does the VAT match up? Yes. Then just move on to finance and even pay it. I think that's the sort of thing. Every process that is just not involving any discretionality whatsoever, but just purely about checking information that can be clearly stated. I think that's where RPI can be applied. And of course, somebody will still have to be there for when the system flags something as irregular. But I think it could do with the bulk of sort of repetitive and very limited value-added tasks in the procurement function.
Thank you. And this is quite a sort of a broad comment here. Relaxing the PCR regs and moving more to a private sector buying approach would require a massive mindset and cultural change in the procurement community. This would present a major change management challenge. Discuss. Now, I appreciate this is quite a broad topic, but do you have a few thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, I think, yes, of course, it will be a change management process, but I think it depends a bit on what we imagine the private sector does. I think we also have a bit of a myth of how the private sector works, because of course, the frontline employee of whatever big multinational, they are not just making decisions on their own. They have to comply with corporate rules, and I'm sure that some corporate procurement rules are not any thinner or easier to interpret than some of the public rules. I think it's about trying to make people feel comfortable with the exercise of discretion to the extent they have it. And that requires training, but also it requires some institutional backup in terms of saying you exercise the discretion, but provided you do it within these parameters, you will get things wrong sometimes, and we accept it and we support you in that. And maybe perhaps also thinking about changes in incentives. So also thinking about whether innovation in procurement processes or getting better outcomes can have an impact in remuneration promotion. Some organizations are terribly inflexible around that. So it's a change management issue, but I don't think it's only about culture. I think it's about the mechanisms that control the exercise of discretion. The other thing is integrity. It's going to be an important issue, of course. Now we are all quite comfortable with the fact that no discretion means no corruption, or very low corruption. With more discretion, there could be more space for all sorts of soft or hard corruption. But I think that's the way forward. I think that trying to create a system for the future where everything is just a tick box exercise, where there's no discretion and people just follow processes all the time, it's not working now, and it's not going to work in the future. So yeah, it's a challenge, but I think it needs to be done.
Thank you. Another key question here is, do you think that there are opportunities to change how we contract with suppliers in the future to be more flexible and collaborative, so that when faced with emergencies or developing technology, etc., we do not tie ourselves up in regulations and contract clauses?
But we can do it now. So there's things that are pretty crazy in the procurement regs, like the innovation partnership, for example, where you can have extremely collaborative, extremely flexible mechanisms. You could, under the emergency procurement now, enter into those sorts of collaborative relationships. I think it's more about having collaborative approach to procurement rather than adversarial one. So that again goes to culture issues more than contractual issues. And the culture now is that contracting authority needs to take a sort of a hard line to trying to squeeze value out of the money they put into contractors. The contractors go into the procurement trying to keep as much financial headway as they can. And of course, that's not going to be a great outcome in most of the times. A more collaborative procurement could be based on open book finance, for example. It could be based on more input from the contracting authority as things evolve, or it could be around having more mixed governance mechanisms of the relationship, trying to get the contractor to adapt to the needs of the organization. I'm not sure the rules prevent any of that. I think you could have as complicated governance of a contract as you want with the existing rules now, just provided that you disclose that from the beginning and everybody tendering for it knows what's coming. So I think we can do more with the rules that we have. And I think contract law is something that should not be on the way, because, you know, contract lawyers will have different views, but the rules of a contract are always subjected to general hardship clauses and to general rebus sic stantibus clauses. So if the conditions change, then the contract can be renegotiated. And if it's something unforeseeable like this emergency, then even the rules on contract modifications just don't really constrain you. So again, going back to some points I made earlier, I think it's about just not being scared of using the flexibility in the rules, and not using sometimes the standard rule as an excuse for what we cannot do, when there is a possibility of exempting it, and being a bit more willing to push the exemptions to the adequate limit.
Great, thank you. A question here from Eleanor Collard-James. What would a contracting authority want to change to be more like private sector purchasing rather than the public contracts regulations?
I know this is difficult.
It's a very massive question.
Yeah, it's pretty massive. I think there's things that you can do, trying to look at how you can use your expertise in the best possible way. So making sure that the tasks allocated to people speak to the strengths, that you have a sort of a collaborative team rather than siloed people with different responsibilities. You could look at how much you can engage with your internal clients, and I know they don't want to hear about procurement, but try to get them engaged with what you're doing as soon as possible. I think that's one big difference between private and public procurement. And then probably more generally try to have a good sense of what's the value that you are adding to your organization, and making that more visible, because I think that's the other place where private and public procurement maybe diverges, and that the private procurement only exists to the extent that they create an advantage for the organization, and in lots of public organizations, procurement exists just because the rules are in place. So I think trying to promote a better two-way conversation on what can we do for you, what do you expect from us, and trying to adapt to that in the way that the team works could make some changes.
And just one final question here for you, Albert, is are you aware of any contracting authorities who are using big data analytics and ML in procurement at the minute?
Yeah, so there's a good example in Ukraine. The whole country is under a system that is called Prozorro. So it's Prozorro, and they use big data analytics through a dashboard that it's available, and they have an English version. And basically what they look at is loads of things, such as what is the accumulated value of contracts of a specific contractor across the public sector. So they can look at issues around we're concentrating too much risk in specific suppliers, or what is the average time of execution of a contract, or they get loads of insight. So that's big data. There's some machine learning that they are trying to develop in terms of some corruption flags that they want to apply. That's still in a pilot, but it's really a very interesting sort of success story on how these things are evolving. So if somebody's interested, I would tell them to Google Prozorro. But if they don't find that, then please email me, and I'm happy to provide links.
Great, thank you very much. So I think that's all of the questions now that delegates have proposed. So thank you once again, Albert. I think your presentation has actually raised a number of issues that would actually make for future webinars that we can look into doing. So that's been really great. And I also want to thank the audience for your participation in the Q&A session.